All right, I'm on today with Alex Epstein, who has an amazing book called Fossil Future. Thanks for joining me today, Alex.
Hey, good to be here, Adrian.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. This has been an issue that I have great interest in, probably for similar reasons as you. There's this huge campaign we have now with climate change, and we really only have one side of the story being told. A lot of the other conversation is out there. You really have to work to find it, because a lot of these scientists who have an opposing view of the mainstream narrative seem to be getting shut out of a lot of these conversations. So I think it's refreshing to have a book like this out in the public, to where we can start to have a more honest and open dialogue about the threat that climate change may or may not pose, or in your case here, more specifically, the benefits of fossil fuels. And one of the main takeaways, you lead into this pretty early on in the book, is that in a lot of these discussions that take place, we hear people talking about the negative consequences of fossil fuel use, but they do so by also ignoring all of the benefits. So tell us, in terms of some of the things you cover in the book, what are some of the primary benefits that fossil fuels have contributed to modern society?
Well, I like this idea of it's only one side of the story. But then I think as we go forward, it's actually even worse than that. So I think from one perspective, we're only seeing one side of the story because we're not seeing the benefits of fossil fuels. So I'll go into that. But then also my ultimate conclusion is actually that the leading people shaping our thinking on this are actually measuring benefit and harm by a different standard, because I'm going to show fossil fuels actually make every aspect of life better, including our safety from climate. And so ultimately, I think what's going on is the people who are ignoring the benefits of fossil fuels, at least the leaders, what they're doing is they're just looking at the world and human beings' place on it. And they're measuring everything by how much impact we have, which they think of as bad as such, and not how good is Earth for us, or for what I would call human flourishing. So that's just sort of a preview of where we're going. But if you look at the benefits of fossil fuels, what do they provide? They provide 80% of the world's energy. And so energy is machine food. It's what allows machines to make us productive and prosperous. Without machines, human beings live in a deficient and dangerous world. It has very few resources. It has a lot of threats. We have a low life expectancy, very few resources per person, and the planet can support very few of us. About 200 years ago, all of this started to change. The world became progressively abundant and safe and opportunity filled. And it's very directly related to the proliferation of machines, because machines allow us to dramatically amplify and expand our naturally very weak productive abilities, so we can do things like farm at 1,000 times the efficiency, or we can build things like incubators, which no number of us can do. So the more machines we have, the more abundant and safe the world is. And fossil fuels have been a uniquely cost-effective way to power machines. So they're low cost. We can talk about, until recently, the opponents of fossil fuels have somewhat driven up the cost, but in general, they're low cost, they're reliable, they're versatile, so they can power every type of machine, and then they're scalable. They can power machines for billions of people in thousands of places, and no other form of energy has come close. This is why they're 80% of the world's energy. They're still growing. They're still growing mostly in the parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy, namely China, which uses a lot of fossil fuel to produce a lot of solar and wind material or equipment that we use here. So I think if you think of it as energy is a total essential of human life being good, and then fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective form of energy. And then the third piece is we live in a world where almost nobody has enough energy. 3/4 of the world uses an amount of energy we would consider unacceptable. 3 billion people use less electricity specifically than a typical American refrigerator. A third of the world is still using wood and animal dung as their primary fuel for heating and cooking. So we're in a dramatically underpowered world. For quality of life to improve, we need vastly more energy, and fossil fuels are uniquely cost effective. And yet the dominant movement says, let's get rid of them rapidly, basically in the next 27 years, in order to prevent their effects on climate. So you can think of it as like fossil fuels are like the drug that has doubled human life expectancy, and people are banning it because of its side effects, but they're not talking about the fact that it doubled life expectancy. And so that's what's suspicious in so many of our leaders' thinking. And that should also make us open to the possibility that maybe they're not telling the truth about the side effects. Because if somebody ignores the benefits of something, I don't trust them about the side effects. An example is if, people in relationships, like if you see somebody who's always criticizing his mother-in-law and can only say negative things about her, and then you found out, wait, she gave them $1 million and he never mentioned that. Well, he's probably exaggerating about the negatives because he has a bias. And I think we'll see the same thing as true with fossil fuels. The same people who ignore the huge benefits that made their lives possible, they are very much distorting the side effects as well.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. And the large premise of this is that, if we have a rise in temperature over 100-year period, well, first of all, I mean, they're kind of assuming that we don't have any human ingenuity, that we were not going to be able to develop ourselves out of this like we've developed ourselves out of every other situation in the past. But that if there's a certain amount of carbon that escapes, the temperature is going to rise, which is going to cause catastrophic effects throughout the globe. But as you note in the book, this is actually one of the coolest periods in the history of the entire planet. So how do we reconcile those things? And why don't more people have access to this information? Why is it not being talked about?
Well, one funny example of this was a couple of years ago. Bernie Sanders published something because it was a hotter than usual July, or maybe it was even the hottest July in 150 years, insofar as you can really measure that, which is dubious, but it was plausible. And he said, this is the hottest month ever in the history of this planet. That's what he said. And it's just like the planet has been, 14 degrees Celsius, 25 degrees Fahrenheit warmer for unbelievable amounts of time, according to the geological record. So one thing is just what the people trying to scare us about climate catastrophe want is they want us to believe that we are in totally uncharted territory, because being in uncharted territory is a lot scarier than being in charted territory. Now, the more technical response they would give is to say, well, yes, it's true the planet has been much hotter, but in terms of when human beings have been around, it's particularly hot. And then that's not even really true, but it's in terms of our civilization of the last couple hundred years, it's hotter than it's been. Let's just say warmer than it's been by about 1 degree Celsius, which is 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's true. But then if you're looking at it, it's what is going on? Is it actually that our bodies can't handle much warmer temperatures if those were to happen? No, we're a tropical species. We actually had to develop technology to be outside the tropics. So it's not that. So what exactly, and is it, if you just think of it concretely, they say, hey, 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius of warming is a catastrophe. The allegedly scientific Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released this report as we're recording this week saying, oh my gosh, we're going to hit 1.5, or we might even hit 2. That's the end of the world. Now, these are measured since the 1800s, so it actually means 0.5 from today or 1 from today. And you just think concretely, if the average temperature on Earth increased 1 degree or even 2 degrees or 3 degrees, which is allegedly just the end of the world, according to these numbers, what would actually happen? Like, just take any given place, it gets 1 degree warmer. Is that the end of it's not even remotely that. And people have to recognize the world has gotten amazingly better overall with the 1 degree warming. So why do you think another half or degree is going to be the end of the world? So I think you brought up the issue of just our ability to develop. This is clearly ignoring our ability to what I would call master nature, including climate. We have an incredible ability to master nature, including climate. This is why in the US, we can thrive in every climate. People can live to 80 in every climate, from polar Alaska to swampy Florida, to Texas, anywhere. So it makes no sense. And you have to, there's a lot of faith going on where we're just told, oh, the scientists say it. And then people don't look into, well, who is that exactly? What are they saying? Are they factoring in all the variables? Are they factoring in our ability to master it? Because it just makes no sense. And so the idea that, well, we should sacrifice fossil fuels, which clearly make life immeasurably better, and by the way, help us protect ourselves from climate. So they help us heat our homes and cool our homes and build sturdy infrastructure and have weather warning systems and alleviate drought with irrigation. Like, we're supposed to sacrifice the thing that our lives depend on and our ability to deal with climate depends on in the name of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees, or half a degree for that matter. It doesn't make sense. And so again, it has this fake appeal to science. And we could talk about the details of how that sausage is made, but just common sense, it makes no sense that you should get rid of your main source of energy, including climate protection, in the name of avoiding some warming.
Yeah, so let's get into that. I mean, how does this consensus get formed? I mean, it's there are thousands of scientists who signed that letter last year disagreeing with the prevailing narrative on climate change. So these views are out here. So what type of control do these institutions have over local governments, federal governments, international bodies, to where they've been able to manufacture all of this this so-called science on this issue?
So one thing, whenever we hear about a consensus, we have to recognize what is it that we're actually hearing. And what we're actually hearing is a statement by certain institutions that we trust that there is a consensus. So this is important. And one example of this is the 97% of climate scientists agree point on climate. If people want to check out how I think about this, go to the website energytalkingpoints.com. Just search, that's my website, search 97%, and you'll see this broken down. I'll break it down a little bit here, but you'll see all the references. But what's notable, if you hear 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, one thing there is, by hearing that, you didn't do the survey, right? So almost everyone repeating that point has no idea what the surveys say. So for all they know, the surveys could be inaccurate or misleading. Also, if you just even notice how it's usually formulated, they'll say 97% of climate scientists agree that climate change is real, or that climate change is mostly man-made. You notice that what they're agreeing to are very trivial things, that climate change is real, or that we're mostly to blame, I wouldn't say blame, but we're mostly causing the 1 degree Celsius warming we've seen so far. Those are very mild claims, and yet they're used to justify extreme policies. So you can see there's a huge non sequitur of saying, hey, 97% of these experts agree on this very mild thing, therefore let's get rid of fossil fuels. That doesn't follow at all. It would be like saying, well, 97% of scientists agree, or doctors agree, that this antibiotic causes a small rash, and therefore we should get rid of all antibiotics. It's a total non sequitur going on there. So you can already see, A, you don't know the 97%, and yet everyone says they agree, and B, it involves a lot of sloppy language. And whenever you see these things involving sloppy language, it's almost always that there's a distortion. And it turns out there are a number of distortions involved, and there's sort of indicated them so far. So one distortion is just that the state of the science about how much we impact climate and what ways gets very much distorted from the time that people are researching it to the time that it gets reported in the New York Times. And in Fossil Future, I map this out. I call it, it's like the researchers do something, the synthesizers, the people synthesizing the research distort it, and then what I call the disseminators distort it further. So you can just get claims that are not at all in the research, but that are made to the general public. That's one thing. But the other side of it is this issue you raised at the beginning of ignoring the benefits of fossil fuels. And this, unfortunately, is done throughout institutions. And so what happens is they exaggerate the negative side effects of fossil fuels, and they ignore the benefits. And they come to this conclusion, oh, there's a consensus that fossil fuels are bad. Well, there's no actual consensus statement that fossil fuels are bad. It's usually a consensus statement that climate change is, quote, real, misinterpreted as climate change is catastrophic, and then coupled with fossil fuels have no benefits, and therefore you should get rid of fossil fuels. So very, very important to know that it's crucial to base decisions on good research, but often the institutions we trust to help us do that, they can distort the nature of the science itself, and then they can also ignore very relevant variables, in this case, the benefits of fossil fuels. And this is how you get a fake consensus that makes no sense at all. And even though it could be based on good research, even though ultimately some of the research is good, but it's just getting totally distorted through this. That's why I called it a sausage making process. But it's not as good as sausage has a lot of benefits. This has no benefits.
Yeah, it's like the initial data could be good, but the conclusions that are drawn from that after it's gone through this filtering process are completely overblown and out of proportion. A lot of these institutions and organizations we've seen throughout the years have had these dire predictions. Back in the 70s and 60s, 70s, they were warned about global cooling and how we're going to be in another ice age. And, from the 80s, we had predictions that the Florida wouldn't be there, or coastal shores would be miles in from where they were in just a matter of years. On down the line, every decade we have another dire prediction where they give a firm year, a firm date that there's going to be this catastrophic flooding, and it never seems to happen. And some people say that the fact that their predictions are always wrong isn't necessarily a real argument against the climate change narrative that they're pushing, but I think
What do they think it is? Do they think it's meaningless?
Well, I think it has to. I think it speaks to the fact that, and I think you touched on this, that it has to do with their thinking and their thought process and how they're evaluating the information and how they're weighing the information and getting to the conclusions that they're reaching. If they've been wrong before based on some sort of methodological flaw that they're using in their analysis, well, then what's the chance that they're going to be correct this time when they've been wrong for the last 30 years?
So I do think I read a lot into track records. I'm a big advocate of track records, and you can think of track records for institutions and you can think of track records for individuals. And one thing that I've noticed in my research is that there are certain individuals who are trusted over decades as what I call the designated experts on what to do about fossil fuels. So these are people, they're the spokespeople in effect for all experts, in terms of telling us what's the state of knowledge and what should we do about it. And what's notable about them is that they are, to a man, terrible in terms of their track record. And I think it's accurate to say to a man, because I don't think any of the ones on this issue that are really longstanding are women. And they all just have this track record of saying, global warming is going to send us to hell, or John Holdren, President Obama's top science advisor. And he became the top science advisor after saying this, after predicting in the mid 80s that we'd have up to 1 billion climate related deaths by 2020. And in fact, we had record low climate related deaths, specifically disaster deaths, in 2020. And so it's very notable that both these people are wrong, but also that the institutions continue to promote them. So maybe the king here is Paul Ehrlich, who is the guy who's been wrong about everything to an incredible degree. I had to invent a term for how wrong these guys are. I call it 180 degrees wrong, because it's not simply they predict a catastrophe that doesn't materialize. They predict catastrophe in an area where life gets better. So they say we're going to run out of resources. We have more resources. They say environmental quality is going to go to hell. It improves. They say climate is going to become unlivably dangerous. It becomes safer than ever, thanks to the state of development and technology and mastery. So they're 180 degrees wrong. And Ehrlich has been wrong since the 60s. And he's been a designated expert. And early this year, he was on 60 Minutes, or maybe it was late last year, but he had a book early this year. And 60 Minutes features him. And they barely say anything about him being wrong. And I publicized this. Unfortunately, Elon Musk boosted it. So a lot of people commented on it and became aware, wait a second, this is a catastrophizer. Why does he get elevated? And so I think this raises a couple of really serious questions. So one is, what is going on methodologically with these people? And that I indicated, I call it catastrophizing. So it's you dramatically overstate the negative side effects, and then you ignore our ability to master those side effects. So you predict it's going to get far warmer than it does, but then, and have far more storms and this kind of thing. And then you ignore our ability to deal with that kind of thing if it happens. That's how you get these apocalypse or catastrophe predictions. And then things actually get worse. But then there's this question of, well, why does the system, these institutions, I call it the knowledge system, like why did these institutions we're trusting for accurate knowledge and accurate guidance about these issues, why do they keep elevating these people who are wrong over and over and over? In my answer, I talk about in chapter 3 of Fossil Future is basically, one is that the knowledge system, these institutions, they have this false assumption that the earth is what I call a delicate nurturer. So it's stable, sufficient, and safe. And then our impact just ruins it. So human beings are just parasite polluters who ruin the earth. That's part of it, when that's not at all what earth is. Earth is wild potential. Earth is actually dynamic, deficient, and dangerous. Sorry, I hope I said it correctly. Yeah, they think it's stable, sufficient, and safe. It's actually dynamic, deficient, and dangerous. And human beings are producer improvers who make it better. So if you think of the earth in a false way, you're always going to predict disaster. But then the other thing, and I referenced this earlier, is I think our leading institutions, when they're looking at the earth and human beings, they're really not looking at it from a human perspective. They're not looking at the earth by the standard of how good is it for human flourishing, which means human life going really well. They're looking at it from the perspective of how much impact are we having, on the premise that impact is bad. And I think what's happened is we have impacted Earth a lot, including the climate some. And the people who believe in the evil of human impact think the world is worse, but they're measuring it by a different standard. And I think that's what our leading thinkers are really doing. They're measuring Earth by an anti-human standard, because being against human impact is an anti-human standard. And I think the perfect example of this is climate, because climate-wise, we're safer than ever. Our climate-related disaster deaths, so from storms and floods and extreme temperatures and wildfires, those are down by a rate of 50 over the last 100 years. And yet our leading intellectuals all say climate is worse than ever. So think about this. The planet is better for human beings climate-wise, but yet it's viewed as the worst ever. That's an issue of standard. That's not an issue of science. That's an issue of you're measuring things by a different standard. And their standard is it's evil to impact climate. So they think the fact that we've impacted climate, even though we're far safer from climate, makes it bad. And my core message in Fossil Future in my work is we need to evaluate the world by a pro-human standard. And if you're listening to people who are evaluating the world by an anti-human standard, to paraphrase the economist George Reisman, it's like listening to a doctor who's on the side of the germs.
Now, you mentioned toward the end of the book that we have to find a way to sort of protect energy freedom. What do you mean by that?
Well, so in any realm, if you want something and you want it in a way that respects people's rights, you need freedom. I mean, that's the policy. Like if you wanted a lot of computers, you would want computer freedom. And people in energy somehow think that, no, freedom doesn't apply to energy. What we really need is one of our really smart politicians like Joe Biden to just dictate everything. That's what we need. And that's somehow going to, or even if it's a really smart person, nobody thinks, does anyone in the world think that in the realm of computing, that we just need to take one person and they get to tell everyone what to do and they get to force it. So it's ultimately the point of a gun. And then that's going to lead to the best computing results. Like nobody believes this remotely. Everyone believes, well, obviously you need to leave producers and consumers free so that all the best ideas have a chance to emerge and develop and the bad ones get thrown out. And then consumers can choose what's best. So it's the exact same thing in energy. We need the freedom for all forms of production to compete and to develop so that we can get the best forms of energy. And ultimately consumers should decide. And a part of freedom is always, you're protecting people's freedom to do things, but part of that is you need to protect their freedom from being endangered to a certain extent. So you want reasonable limits on pollution, and you can't just start a facility that's likely to explode or something like this. But so I break this down in terms of what I call the freedom to trade, the freedom to develop, the freedom to compete, and the freedom from endangerment. I break that down in chapter 10. But at a high level, energy should be like computers. We need the same freedom there. And so anyone who talks about energy policy and it has any feel of I'm going to dictate what sources of energy people should use, that is not an intelligent person in practice. Unfortunately, many smart people who are intellectuals think that the way to be smart is that you get to dictate what everyone else does. But that is idiotic because no human being is smart enough to be equal to millions of smart people thinking and competing. So this is just a general pet peeve of mine about many people in economics and other fields, is that unfortunately, like there's this prestige of, oh, this person did really well. They went to this school. So they're going to dictate what I want from them is to tell me how our energy system should be constructed. And no, what I want that from them is to explain to the public why we need to leave the energy system free. So that's really what smart people should do. And this is a general message in case anyone cares what I think, is that if you're sort of an ideas person and you are smart and good at explaining things, your job, if you're in policy, is to help define and make the case for freedom. It is not to make the case for you being a dictator.
And you're making some very solid points, and all of this is fantastic. The issue that we have with this conversation a lot of times, though, is that people haven't heard it. They never get to hear it.
Well, now they do. Now your listeners do.
Good. So, but we have a media establishment that won't talk about it. We have this narrative being pushed in schools. So cradle to grave, a lot of people, this is all they know is the catastrophizing about the climate. So what's the best way for us to start to have more productive, meaningful conversations with people who haven't heard any of the stuff you're talking about right now?
Well, concretely, I mean, I'm a big advocate of this resource I've created, which is totally free, called energytalkingpoints.com. And I created it originally for politicians because I wanted to help politicians who are pro-freedom make the case for pro-freedom policies. And what I found is they didn't have the right facts. They didn't have the right arguments. And as good as I thought my books were, they couldn't just take a book and then use that directly. It was too much work. So I created this website where every single thing is tweet length, and you have answers to every issue. So one thing I've tried to do is just as much as possible to empower like-minded people with the best messaging. So I think a lot of what I do is resource creation or even tool making, where I'm creating these resources for others to use. The other is we need to note that we're at a really special time right now. We have a global energy crisis. People's minds are more open than ever because the establishment has clearly failed. So I think that's another thing. And then finally, I think one thing you can do that's very effective is find individuals whose ideas you think are good and help promote them. And this certainly includes me, but I'll just give an example. We don't have to go into the details, but we discussed this in advance. I was at a hearing a couple weeks ago, and I got this insane attack by Representative Cori Bush, who tried to portray some individualist things I wrote in college as white supremacist. And I was able to very effectively answer and refute her there. And people liked what I said. And so that what I said got seen by millions of people, and thousands of people bought my book, and tens of thousands of people got exposed to my ideas about energy, not just my refutation of her attack. And what we really want is for the individuals saying the right things to be unignorable by the media. There's a certain stage at which you get unignorable. Somebody like Jordan Peterson is an example where enough people liked what he was saying, where the New York Times had to cover him. And I'm sort of on the threshold, not at his level, but just on the threshold of notoriety, where the more people talking about what I'm doing, the more it's hard to ignore me. And for me, it's great. Like some people, if they get elevated, like they crack and stuff, I don't care at all about any of the criticism stuff unless it's factual. So I can handle whatever happens. And I don't have any skeletons in my closet that are going to be discovered where I'm going to be canceled or something like that. So I'm very eager to start getting trashed by the mainstream media, because everything I've done in my life and with my research team is to make sure that we are as right as possible. So if somebody proves me wrong about something, I will admit it. But in general, I think I'm definitely right. And I think so if people like what I'm saying here, I really suggest follow energytalkingpoints.com, subscribe to my newsletter on that website, and just share what I'm doing, because we are getting at a point where this is one of the central issues. And I do think that in a year, I'm going to be unignorable by the media. And then once that happens, people are going to see what happens when I debate the opposition. That already happens. You can see them all on YouTube, but I think it's going to be very public, and it's no longer going to work to ignore me or to just try to say, oh, this guy's some crazy climate denier.
All right. And real quick, where can people find the book, and how can they also reach you personally if they want to contact you? Okay.
So best way to find the book, you can get it any number of ways at fossilfuture.com. So it's just fossilfuture.com. And then in terms of me, so my personal email is alex@alexepstein.com, alex@alexepstein.com. And then I'm also on all the major social media platforms, but overwhelmingly I'm on Twitter. So twitter.com/Alex Epstein, which is my name.
All right, Alex, fantastic stuff, bro. Thanks so much for joining me today. I appreciate it, man.
Hey, my pleasure.